I'm Bill Oglesby, the professor for the documentary capstone class at VCU's Robertson School of Media and Culture. Normally at the end of each semester, these senior documentary students put their capstone doc projects into a series of shows called VCU InDepth. Now this spring, as we all know, ended up being a little different. The students went home for spring break and never came back. At that point, most of the footage for the documentary projects was shot, but virtually nothing had been written or edited. The students had to do the best they could on home computer equipment with some basic editing software. We thought you might like to see how they did. I might suggest when watching these that you view them less from the standpoint of judging their technical proficiency and more from an appreciation of students trying to do their best to tell a story under unexpected circumstances. In this first mini-documentary called The Price of a Life, The Richmond Slave Trade, student producers Ben Mendez, Jackson Myers, and Cameron Palazzo tell us about the domestic trade of enslaved human beings that occurred in Richmond.
So there's no equivalent to it today. If we were going to look at Microsoft or look at General Motors or look at Amazon, maybe Amazon will approach that level someday, but really there's nothing in our current economy that's an equivalent to it.
When the domestic trade began, and let's call it 1778, when the importation was stopped in Virginia, anyway, as a result of Virginia's independence from England in 1776, by which that independence gave Virginia the power to become the up-south market. And the domestic trade was initiated. There was a lot of money to be made. There was a lot of labor that was needed. Virginia saw the economic advantage in this, and that led to the ending of the transatlantic trade, so that instead of England being the recipient of the resource, Virginia then would be that recipient.
Well, the main reason is because, as we characterize it, Richmond was the second largest marketplace for the domestic trade in enslaved African people. It grew over the course of the 30 to 40 years after the end of the transatlantic slave trade. And because of its position on the James River, because of its position on the East Coast, it got to be a funneling point for those coming even from Maryland and other states into Richmond or into Virginia, and then out from there. It became that important to the trade in the 19th century.
And it becomes really the centerpiece of the Richmond economy. There were certainly lots of other things going on here. There was flour milling, so we had large flour mills. There certainly was tobacco processing, but at the center of the economy during those years, immediately before the Civil War, the slave trade was the generator of much of the economy.
The entire society was based on enslaved labor, the trade and the agriculture and the products that came out of the agriculture. It was central to the development of Richmond, of Virginia, and of the United States as a whole.
Talking about the period when they're no longer coming from Africa, then you are talking about people who are from all over Virginia, from all over the plantations from around the area, and up and down the coast. Because, keep in mind that slavery existed all over the United States. It wasn't just in the southern region. And so people who were wanting to, sell their enslaved people could bring them to a market. That market would sell them south, and then from there they would be shipped down to places like New Orleans, but also places along the way. And mostly it's going to be those port cities along the way.
By now, Virginia becomes a breeding state. And the capital moves from Williamsburg, the colonial capital, into Richmond. And Virginia could then create, if you will, its own market. And so many of the holding pens, warehouses and auction blocks were concentrated in Shockoe Bottom, often called a city within a city.
And when you think about what Shockoe Bottom would have looked like during that period, we normally think about, oh, well, it was, some the markets along, but there are also holding pens that where, like cattle, people were sold, they were held in pens before their sale.
There's so many stories, narratives that Africans enslaved left about some of the treatment that they received. Probably the most devastating was the separation of families. The same thing that's happening at the southern border of the United States right now. The separation of families where babies were torn from their mothers, where men who were fathers or husbands were separated from their wives forcibly, where the owner then took the wife and created another life, and that life then was sold into bondage, where babies were stolen from their nursing mother's arms and sold into bondage. The children never knew who their mother was. The mother never knew what happened to their children. Men and women who were beaten with whips, lynched. When a person is looked at not, again, with human qualities, but as a product, a slave was a commodity. A slave was a product. A slave was subhuman somehow, so that the prowess, the humanity, the dignity, the knowledgeability, the essence, the spirituality, the vibrance of African people was diminished, if not completely erased, not only in the minds of the captors, but also in the mannerisms and the methodology in which the trade took place.
Tracy Harder, who was working on this collection, she came across the name Eliza, an enslaved woman. She could have been a teenager for all I know, but she was purchased for $1,100. And Tracy, she followed Eliza's name going down the receipt. And she would see Eliza's name again, purchasing medicine for Eliza, $1. Purchasing clothes for Eliza, $5. And then going on down, it said Eliza, midwife. So evidently Eliza was pregnant with a child, and so she gave birth. And so the Templeman had to hire a midwife in order to help Eliza give birth to her child. The Telegraph Templeman notifying Hector Davis about this event, about this birth of this child. And then below that, you see medicine again for Eliza, $1. And then you go down to turn the next page. Oh, one other thing is that they purchased flannel, which was a blanket of some sort for Eliza. And then when you go to the next page, it says payment for Eliza's burial. She died, evidently from giving childbirth. And then you see after that, clothing for Eliza. They purchased clothes for her in order to be buried in. And then it says coffin for Eliza. You see a person's life being played out from a person who was purchased to be a slave, became a mother, died from giving birth, and then buried. And then you don't see Eliza's name again.
History is a long story of the fact. Martin Luther King Jr. was known for saying that, and I appreciate that perspective, because unless we really understand not only who African people were before their enslavement in America. And unless we know what the nature, the socio-economic, cultural, and political nature, because it's the foundation of America. Unless we really understand that, we can't be clear about how we got to where we are.
Our producers remind us that it is through history that humanity learns how to heal and to move toward a better world. Our next documentary this evening was actually a solo project from Cecilia Kim, a graduate student in the Robertson School's Multimedia Journalism Master's Program. Called Food Access for All, it introduces us to food experts in Richmond who share their insight on the food access problem and how they tackle it through education.
The overarching mission of Feed More here in Central Virginia is that we are the core hunger relief organization. What we're really doing is addressing food insecurity. Food insecurity being that which families are not quite sure where their next meal is coming from. In our case, we cover 29 counties and 5 cities, so it's a large area. We have somewhere between 190,000 and 200,000 folks who are food insecure. Something a little under 50,000 of them are children. There's a great deal of the folks who are underneath the federal poverty line, and a great deal of the folks who are not within a mile of a grocery store. In Central Virginia, our rural folks, many of them not within 10 miles of a grocery store. Well, a great part of that issue is lack of access to healthy food. Because if they do get to some snack shop at a gas station, sometimes those are called food swamps, by the way. There's food, just not very good food. There certainly isn't access to produce.
The vast majority of our food comes from donor relationships. And of that donor pool, the vast majority of that comes from retail partners. So all of your major national retailers, the Kroger's, Walmart's, Food Lions, Publix, you name it, if there's a grocery store or a retail partner, we have a relationship with them. That relationship often is managed at the national level with Feeding America. So these major retail partners actually have their own donation programs. So those donation programs are managed really by the vendor themselves. And so Kroger on a national level sets their donation policy. You know, they decide what can and will be donated. We have our partner agencies, we call that our direct store program, where we pair agencies with a store in their community and they go pick up on a daily basis. So that represents a significant amount of the food that we get as an organization, of the roughly 30 million pounds of food that we receive.
7 years ago, we made a goal to get up to 40% of our distributions would be produce. At the time, we were moving 18 million pounds and had about 13% produce. We're now moving close to 30 million pounds of food each year, and about 30% of what we're doing is produce.
We also get food through USDA government programs. Typically, USDA and government donated food represents anywhere between 13 and 15% of our total. Everything else is donated.
Given the day, we have probably over 200 some volunteers either on site or off in various different programs. So they could be packing boxes for our senior commodity packing program, or they could be in the kitchen, packaging meals for Meals on Wheels, or the various frozen meals that go out to the partners that we work with.
Every day we prepare freshly made meals, which are made in the community kitchen, and then they're packaged up in our packaging room. That's for Meals on Wheels. That's for all our senior clients or people who are unable to cook for themselves or are home-ridden and can't leave. By serving our elderly community, we make sure that they're getting a healthy meal if they're unable to fix it themselves, or they have also income restriction because they have to decide whether they're going to purchase their medicine or what they're going to have to eat. Then we have our Kids Cafe program where we feed the afternoon school programs for the city of Richmond, Chesterfield, and Henrico. And we're making sure that children are getting a meal before they go home if they're not able to get that meal when they get home because the parent is working long hours or is at work that entire time, or they just may not have the means to have food or the supply to feed themselves or their family. Then our third part that we do with the frozen meal packaging session is we make these frozen boxes that go out to our clients, and that's something that happens bi-weekly, that we produce anywhere from 400 to 600 boxes. We would not be able to do our job if it wasn't because of the volunteer help that we get every day. That's really the spill of the work. It's the community that we help that comes back and gives the help so we can serve the community.
Our latest really has been our senior commodity packing program. And it takes about 51 some volunteers to keep a session going every single Friday. I like to think that it's a slice of the community, really. And that, I think, is also the beauty of the volunteer program, that it really is a great example of how cross-functional, generational teams can actually work for a common cause.
Mise en Place has been here now for 16 years. When I first opened in the early 2000s, that's when the 17th Street Farmers Market was a real farmers market. And so on Thursday afternoons, they would have everything from flowers to fresh produce. So we would certainly get things there, and that's really kind of how we formed relationships with some of the farmers. We have been collaborating with many of the food nonprofit organizations such as Feed More, with ZestFest, and our other local community where we compost. We bring in as much local ingredients as we can from the area farms. Our main pantry items are grocery store purchase, so our pantry staples. But we like to show people how you can incorporate fresh, local ingredients into your everyday dishes. In terms of the labor force, especially in this country, in the food, whether it's food service, it's huge. Even the farmers. So it's really big and can be big business and can be very political.
I'm driving 150 miles, 2 hours, 2.5 hours away just to find milk that I can sell to the public that's from Virginia, that's from a small farm.
24 yogurt and 24.
Okay. I mean, all dairy farms across the state are being shut down because the bigger operations are putting them all out of business. The USDA, they're in on it. They're over-regulating these small farms, and they just can't stand it anymore.
My presence is a political statement. Like, food should be small scale, it should be local, it should be meaningful, it should be restorative. So it's like, that's the foremost reason that I want it. I want to be here as a producer, just to be like a placeholder, so like a future generation can keep having this as something that is part of our food system. That it shouldn't just all be anonymous blocks of cheese that are coming from animals that live in warehouses. Nationally and in Virginia, it's complicated to try and get milk from a farm. Usually has to go through a co-op, or you have to belong to a herd share. But I'm in a different category, so I'm a licensed manufacturing grade dairy processor. That means that I can buy milk from a farmer. I, through a connection at Organic Valley, found a family that had just decided to leave the co-op and close down their dairy because the money is so bad. And I said, look, I'm looking to purchase a small amount of milk. We're talking about downsize from 50 cows down to like 8 cows. and I'll commit to you that I'll buy all of your milk, and would you be willing to stay in dairy? And I think that there was really no question for them because they love cows so much and they didn't want to ever stop, but they had to because most dairies are losing money to produce the milk.
My whole MO for what a farm to family does is to support people like you. What I'm trying to do is help create a local, sustainable food model and getting people the healthiest, freshest, most nutritious food that they can get.
The problem is there's no one's buying fresh and local and eating and cooking at home and eating at home. That's the problem. People have addictions, so they can't help. They're stuck.
Sugar addiction?
Yeah, they're stuck. I mean, they're so used to convenience and no one cooking for them. Our culture is eating out. That's a really vulnerable, bad place to be in when you're counting on all of these things that you have no control over that run your life. It's capitalism, you know, it's like make more stuff, sell more stuff, buy more stuff, throw more stuff away. I mean, it's just a cycle. The supermarket's just the dumping point for all of these highly processed products that the people that make them can't sell without the grocery stores. They just load the shelves with all these products. A lot of them expire and they either throw it in the garbage or they donate it to a food bank. I think it's close to 50% of all the food produced in this country gets thrown in the trash. It's an oxymoron to say that you live in a country that throws away almost 50% of its food and then you have a food access problem.
From a retail perspective, there is a difference between saleability and safety. And so saleability is things with expiration dates. Expiration dates are not regulated by the federal government with the exception of baby food. So really all expiration dates, whether it's a best by date, a use by date, or an expiration date, is just a manufacturer's recommendation for food quality. It has nothing to do with food safety. So there's a lot that just ends up in the grocery store that people, for whatever reason, aren't buying based off of these, quite honestly, arbitrary expiration dates. What we get from retailers is as they're going through and looking at their saleability standards and looking at really what are consumers going to buy in the grocery store. If a consumer's not going to buy it, they're going to pull it off of the shelf and give it to us, and then we can distribute that to people. We're a part of the food recovery stream, so where we can actually take food that is wholesome, it is completely edible, it is food safe, and move it rather than into a waste receptacle directly for human consumption.
Personally, I don't think after being in this platform for 11 years, it's a food access problem or there's a food desert. It's not an access problem. I think it's an education problem. It's one of the best apples right here that you could ever eat. Hey, not only is there an abundance of food, but you don't even have to leave your house to get whatever you want. Just go online and purchase everything and they deliver it to your house. If you don't have internet, there's libraries you can go to that are free. If you can't get to the library, there's public transportation. You can have any takeout from any restaurant, anywhere near where you live to deliver.
It's the income disparity that really dictates who can go to these places and who cannot. And so the system, if you will, has to find a way to not penalize those who have, but to allow those who don't have the opportunity to get there, at least to get to some place. And that's bigger than a food bank can really deal with.
The food that is really bad for you is very accessible and very cheap. My son, when he was in elementary school, almost always ate the healthy day meal, which usually had a salad, a cheese stick, some crackers, a yogurt, but the yogurt is Twix cereal yogurt. And now that they are in middle school, they don't really have a salad. So I went on to the school menu page. And the breakfast can often be a Pop-Tart or something very sugary. And then the lunch, you had maybe 4 choices of lunch, but they always had a chicken sandwich, 2 different types of pizza, and French fries. Those are every day. And then there must have been 30 different options of bagged chips or pretzels or cookies. I would love to see just a salad bar. And I do know of other chefs in this country who that has been their mission. Unfortunately, it's a big challenge, and unfortunately, there are, with many public schools, over 50% of those kids rely on the breakfast and lunch program that is available, where they get the most of their nutrition for the day.
So why does food security continue to exist in this country, one of the wealthiest countries in the world, right? It's always been a vexing question. The core of any of this gets down to income. It gets down to jobs. I mean, employment is such an issue for our folks. I often ask people, try the food stamp challenge. Live off $4.50 a day for a week. Can it be done? Yes. You'll see how challenging it is. Can you get really good, healthy food with that? Probably not. Food banks are built for emergency purposes. Out of every 12 meals that our clients use between food stamps or SNAP, food assistance from the government, food banks only provide one of those 12. Education, first of all, is the engine of our democracy. But second of all, where the workforce is going, you simply must have the proper education or you'll be left behind. Education, the proper education, getting people to employment is really going to be the answer, because so much of these folks' issues all center around lack of income.
If we don't do it, then, and if something goes wrong and if something fails, then that means somebody's not getting a meal that day.
Fortunately, around here in Richmond, I do see that there are a lot of different programs that are offered to children, to teenagers, to families. Just the food community alone, we really try and do a lot, whether it's in the school systems, because I think that's really where it starts, is our kids.
I have children, and I think one of the things I do for them is create a home that smells like food. That's one of the things, is that home should be this place that you can smell food cooking. Keep trying, keep feeding children food that they can, that putting them on farms, letting them taste, letting them smell.
The byproduct of eating healthy is that you're going to be happier. We're all in this together. We care about you. You live in the community. That's real, hopefully, long-term change, yeah.
Cecilia points out that in a country that wastes as much as 40% of its food, food insecurity persists, and many are finding ways to resolve it. Well, that's it for VCU In Depth for this week. We'll be back in 2 weeks for some other examples of student documentary work in the midst of a pandemic. I'm Bill Oglesby. Thanks for joining us.